Hi everyone. We're here today again with Brian Smuk. It's Conversations with Susanne. Brian Smuk is a chiropractor, a neurological chiropractor, and a regular chiropractor who's been practicing for
20 plus years now.
20 plus years. And we are going to talk today a little bit about injury and recovery from injury and how the body and the brain all work together. So the question is, or the topic that we sort of want to start with, and maybe you can explain this, is so I do dynamic tie. By the way, SuzanneJ.com, and you can see my YouTube. This video will be on YouTube under Susanne Jakubowski. And Brian is at Smuk Chiropractic and Wellness. And the website is Spine, Body, and Soul, is it? Is it?
SBSHealth.com.
SBSHealth.com. Okay, good. Anyways, okay, so now we start. So what I want to discuss is that often when we're working on someone through dynamic tie or even through chiropractic work, and the work that Brian does is very interesting. You know, somebody will come in with a knee injury and we won't work on the knee. We'll work on the rest of the body, maybe the feet, maybe IT bands, whatever. And yet, they're amazed that the pain goes away. So can you explain why, when somebody gets a diagnosis, you don't necessarily have to work on that part of their body?
Okay, I'll try. I'll do my best.
Okay.
Let's take the knee, for example.
Okay.
So someone comes in and says they've got whatever amount of knee pain. They've had some imaging. They've had some other diagnostic testing. Maybe it's ultrasound. They've done something very regionally to basically confirm what they wanted to hear was, yes, your pain exists.
Right.
That's probably the biggest one that comes up.
Mm-hmm.
People want to be, number one, people want to be believed.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They don't want to go in and hear, well, it's all in your head.
Right.
Whereas as the neurology guy, I know it's all in our heads.
Right. Right. Because everything is about the brain, right?
Yeah, pretty close.
Pretty well.
So again, sticking to that knee example, perhaps the wear is happening at the knee, but in that whole mechanical chain with walking, for example, maybe the problem is actually at a foot or the other foot or in the hip or the low back, mm-hmm. or potentially even up in the upper part of the neck as well. Right? Mm-hmm. Something is off center, which then changes your gait all the way down the chain. Mm-hmm. But the part that's wearing out happens to be the knee.
Right. And at yoga, that's what we are looking at as well. If somebody comes in, we're looking at alignment. We're looking at, if they say knee, most often I find there is a foot issue. Yeah. We're looking at is one hip higher than the other, shoulders, this type of thing. Yeah. So then what happens when you put someone back in alignment? Does that fix the problem? Is it a one time, okay, this was your problem, so now we're mm-hmm. going to work on it? Maybe hips or like you said earlier.
And sometimes, and when it's not, it doesn't necessarily mean, hey, we failed. We didn't do. That's not the thing that's going to work. Well, maybe that's just one piece of the puzzle. So yes, today we tried to correct the foot, gave you some exercise to do to stabilize it. Maybe it's not just the foot. Maybe we need to go to the hip or the low back, mm-hmm. or up to the neck, or change something in how their brain is seeing their body. Mm-hmm. And we just have to kind of chip away at it until we find basically all of the pieces. Depending how long the injury's been there, whether it's knee or hip or just about anywhere, there are other compensations that happen to your gait, how you walk, to your balance, how you stand, mm-hmm. even how you sit. Mm-hmm. And those compensations aren't just at the joint above and below. Some of those compensations are up in your brain. So mm-hmm. if I've got something wonky going on with an ankle, I'm going to stand a bit askance. I'm going to walk a little bit off to the side. But the problem with that is now my body's leaned over and now my eyes are off level to the horizon. And my brain hates that. Mm-hmm. The first thing my brain's going to do is take my head down. No matter how I'm standing, it's going to take my head and tip me. So my eyes are level with the horizon. Mm-hmm. So now not only do I have all this other stuff going on below and I'm walking this way, well, now I've just started to cause whatever problem you can think of up in here, because now I'm going to walk around all day like this.
Right. And you do see that. You see people who always seem to have their head tilted to the side, or I was talking to you earlier about somebody client that we share that has vertigo that, you know, has her head up there. So there's been some kind of compensation that she's done for her in regards to pain that she had in her neck.
Yeah.
So then, so how?
And that's interesting. I'm going to jump in there because you said, with just from what we discussed before, with that compensation happening. So, for example, that person with the neck up this way, and the problem was actually coming from the knee or the ankle. Well, now she's sitting down, and the neck is still here.
Right.
Right. There's really nothing happening with where the true initial problem was, but that compensation's been trained in.
Right.
And it's its own program now.
Right.
Which is going to lead to whatever. Probably some other compensation in the shoulders, in the hips. It's just this big circle that starts to happen until we start to reprogram that and get her out of that back to here.
So how do you reprogram someone?
Well, that is the magic, isn't it?
That is the magic. Okay, that's secret. So, but with exercise, is it just treatments, or is there exercise and treatment?
It's always both.
It's always both.
Yep. It's some kind of, maybe there's a manipulation, maybe it's a drill, some kind of neurologic drill with movement, or maybe it's the eyes, maybe it's a balance exercise, and those usually end up going home with the person as well, because it takes some repetition to reprogram these things. Think of it like trying to learn or just improve a golf swing. Right, we've done a certain movement the same way for thousands of reps.
Right.
We've developed quite an efficient program for it. If we want to change that program, you can't come into my office and have me adjust you twice and think it's going to be better.
Right.
You need to go home and do 2 or 3 or 8,000 reps to reprogram it, or program it to the better position. The thing that we're lucky about is, for the most part, we have an already kind of base program that's correct. We just need to get back to it. We don't have to learn to walk completely new.
Right.
We just need to get back to our old walking program instead of the injured program.
So, and most of the people that walk around, they're not even aware. Like one of the things I want to really do is I can watch people walking on the street and take a video or a picture of them and say, hey, here's a picture of you. Do you realize that you're way head forward, or that you're slouching like this? You know, and so, you know, they're not aware. And also, what is the stress that places on the body?
Depends on where, but I guess the stress would be, from a pure physical standpoint, would be early wear, early degeneration, whether that's a knee and ankle, in the neck, whatever you want to call it. What's the change biochemically? Well, there's more, as soon as you get into that osteoarthritic or degenerative change, now you've got changes biochemistry-wise. You're going to have changes in calcium deposition, right? Spurring is a completely altered calcium deposition. Right? You've got spurring where there shouldn't be spurring. You'll have soft tissue infiltration of calcium as well in those situations. So it starts to alter your chemical balance too.
So when you're talking about spurring, you're talking like you're developing bone spurs, and then and so we see a lot of clients that have like bone spurs in the hip, and that's why they end up with a hip replacement, because it takes over and causes pain.
Spurs get bigger, and the cartilage that's in there just wears out. And when we say spurring, the fancy name for spur, if you have an X-ray report, it's going to be an osteophyte. That's the fancy radiologist term for it.
Yeah, we see that on reports. Okay, so then there's also, like you said, so there's that chemical change, there's the physical change of what it's doing to your body, and then there's also the sort of the nervous system change that happens, because of course all those misalignments affect
that reprogramming. And then there's also the psycho-emotional component, especially if it's something chronic or chronic pain. You know, with chronic pain, you can't really be all that happy.
Yeah, exactly.
It's going to change your mood, which then further changes your brain chemistry. So you're more likely to stay that way, or eat to kind of fill in the blanks kind of thing, right? You'll fill the holes with something junky because it's easy, because your brain's kind of crying out for, it's everything's upregulated, so your brain's crying out for a little more glucose, because our brains run on glucose. So what do you reach for when you need a little more glucose? It's going to be something really simple and sugar, instead of something a little better for us.
We see in yoga, so often somebody who comes into class at the very beginning, and they're so incredibly tight. They're so, dysfunctional really in their life. And then as we work on them, they open up, they change, they're able to do more, have more range of motion. So is that their brain also kicking in? Is that also like their brain working to help them, or is that strictly a physical manifestation of what's going on in the yoga?
Well, I think with yoga you get some of the, just like yoga or Tai Chi, Qigong, all those things. I think there's a very direct neurochemical change with movement in general, but certain, especially with some of the Chinese arts. I don't know yoga well enough to say, but there's some very direct knowledge. But with certain movements, cause very direct and specific neurochemical changes that happen in the brain as well.
Yeah, and I feel like lately I've been guided to add a lot of movement into my yoga. And I don't know, I feel like it makes people feel better. I feel that it helps their recovery when they have injuries. And also, I think because of COVID and situation, people are just sitting too much, and so movement is
Absolutely
a smart thing to add into a practice. Of course, we're always focusing on strength and flexibility, but then when you add movement, it just adds a new dimension. And I think, especially for the senior population, a lot of things we do in the movement involve coordination of arms and legs and that kind of thing. So I think that is also helpful for the brain, is it not?
It is. And probably the trickiest thing is that we don't lose these things quickly. It's a very slow creep until all of a sudden you're 60 or 70 and you realize, well, I can't do that anymore. Well, it kind of crept away over 15 or 20 years just from lack of use, right? That program, that patterning, that movement pattern just kind of slips away. And your brain it's just like building muscle, it's use it or lose it. And when you don't fire those pathways, be it out to the hand or be it some of the pathways that are within the brain, they start to get smaller, they atrophy. And when they're still there, but they get so small and unused that it's harder to fire them until we realize later on, hey, why can't I do that anymore?
I think, we say that, what did you say, 50s, 60s? I can't remember what age you said, but I feel like all these things are happening earlier to people, that we're seeing them even in younger people. Do you agree or not so much? Or? I agree. And
I agree.
Do you feel do you feel that's devices? Do you feel that's sitting? Do you have a thought on that? Why are we seeing it so much younger? I feel also food might play a part.
I think it's a combination of food and the type of activity we get, for sure. There's less, I'll say, neural or brain enriching foods, which is all the good fats that are good for our bodies too, for muscles and whatnot. And I think it's the type and quality of movement we get. There's so much more at younger ages, so much more sitting, so much more, I'll say focus, but it's not good focus in terms of the eyes looking at something right here. There's not as much like looking out there.
Yeah.
And tracking things. Like if you go back to not all that long ago when we were hunter-gatherers for the most part, we rarely looked at our laps. We were always scanning the horizon and tracking things, right? Watching a bird, that's working the eyes from side to side, watching the sky, all those sorts of things.
I'm just laughing because my son lives out in the country up in North Maine. He has Thunder Bay, it has a big property, and when he was younger, he was diagnosed that he needed glasses, and then he moved away. And he says the reason he doesn't need to use his glasses is because he's always looking in the distance. He's always got things to see. He's not, and he also doesn't use social media and devices, so he's not always looking down. And then I'm laughing as well because on our way home from our holiday, I literally was knitting and reading for 7 hours, and then I realized oh my gosh, I've hardly looked up once. I was just so intent on what I was doing. I wasn't even looking up, and then of course, do I start to get
everything else kind of plays in?
Yeah, everything else plays a role. Okay, so what can people do? What should people do? First of all, I guess they should come and address their issues, right? But what can they do for their brain when their body's out of alignment? Give me some. Is that a fair question?
I think so.
Okay.
You know, this probably the simplest thing to do is just check your balance. Right? Stand up, stand close to a corner. So if you fall over, you don't have far to go. Stand a corner, close your eyes. See how well, put your feet together, stand in the corner, see how well your balance is. Do you stand easily on 2 feet? Do you start to drift? Is it one way versus others? Is it always the same direction? And then if that's okay, narrow the stance a bit. Put one foot in front of the other, like you're on a balance beam, and look at that as well. And see, then stand on 1 foot. How well do I balance on one leg? And if that's okay, then do one leg but eyes closed, because those should all be relatively easy.
And I think actually they say you should be able to stand with your eyes closed for a minute. Is that right?
Yeah.
And I find in my classes people cannot do
at
that.
At least 30 seconds, and that's with eyes open. And it should be, importantly, it should be the same both sides, relatively close to the same.
Is it ever? Like when you see clients, is it ever balanced? Like are people ever there?
When I'm done with them.
Good answer. Well, because I know myself, like I feel like in yoga, I mean, I've been with some of the most senior teachers, and who have amazing practices, and they're not in balance. I mean, I don't know if they have good balance, but they're not. You look at their bodies and you go, oh, they're a little out there, and there's, yeah.
And it's certainly not an age thing. It's part by any means. I think it's more injuries and just kind of the pieces of life that come and kind of affect you, hit you, or build you in one way or another. So it's certainly not like an age. At age 65, we're going to see this kind of degeneration first. It could be anywhere. It could be the 8-year-old after a concussion. It could be the 40-year-old after a bike crash. It could be the 60-year-old because they've had all of those things times 4, and they've started for that to happen. Interesting piece of research, fairly recent, and it shows that almost every person with dementia has some kind of head injury in their past.
Really?
Yeah.
So I've been reading a lot about dementia and it just being a case of malnutrition. Is there a link there between injury and poor diet?
Absolutely, because with injury you have to the whole system upregulates. So if you were already a little under or malnourished, we'll say, and then you have some kind of injury that affects, we'll say, the overall neurology, then your brain's actually asking for even more of what you haven't been giving it. So it can't fix itself very well if it didn't have the fuel just to run on.
Yeah.
It's hard to fix itself when it needs more of it.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point.
And when I say, and when we talk about injury, like injury to the brain, not just physical, concussion. That's the easy one. Everybody knows that one. A whiplash. You may not hit your head,
right?
But spinal cord can pull, which comes from below, and you can also have, that rapid stop and rebound from that, where the brain actually is kind of like scrambling the eggs.
Yeah.
But beyond the physical pieces, you've also got those biochemical, those nutritional things you need that you don't have. Well, that's just going to cause some kind of degenerative change.
Okay, so let's just say that again. So if you have an injury and you are suffering from malnutrition, let's say a lack of magnesium, because we know magnesium is like, your brain is not going to be able to heal itself because you just don't have enough juice in there to actually heal.
Yeah, you didn't have enough before, and now it's asking for even more.
Right.
They can't go
that's
very
key,
well.
Everyone. That is so key, because so we really, again, and so how do you go about that? Do you how would you know if you're dealing with somebody like that, that's maybe has dementia or whatever, or how would you know what their deficiency is, or that their brain doesn't have the proper nutrients to heal, just because from the fact that it hasn't healed? Or
well, the very first thing I look at with the people with this sort of nervous system injury, neural injury, whatever you want to call it, I just look at, are they getting enough just plain old glucose? Because that's just a basic fuel. And if we need to, and this will go against everything we normally talk about, then we try to get them drinking, like having some very consistent sweetener in everything they're eating. So it might be sipping a bit of maple syrup in their water all day, what we call sweet waters,
Right.
or something like that. Now it's very low amounts.
And we're not saying everybody needs to do this.
No, this is when your brain is saying, it's constantly needing a little bit of fuel because it's trying to fix itself.
Mm-hmm.
And the brain it runs on glucose. It needs glucose. It needs oxygen. It needs stimulation.
Mm-hmm.
And the glucose is the fuel. And if you run low, it doesn't matter if you stimulate it and give it lots of oxygen. It can't do much because it's out of gas.
So, and we're not saying white sugar.
No.
Where you're using maple syrup, which has
Yeah,
250 antioxidants, by the way, and it's much more healthier.
So
but I mean, it's still in your body. It's still excess sugar. Sugar.
So we can use maple syrup. We can use a little bit of fruit juice. And I'm certainly not one to recommend juice very often. Very limited scope. For me, juice comes up with head injury type things when you need the glucose and with gout. Right, cherries. So the tart cherry juice. That's about the only time I ever recommend juice.
Right.
But with the neurology issue, we just need that little bit of glucose going in. So, and even with juice, it might be diluted juice, which doesn't usually taste very good, but it's a way to get a little bit of that sugar in.
And is there a time of day? You saying with every meal? I have heard sometimes that before you go to bed, if you take a little bit of sugar, it'll actually help you sleep. That is actually why some people are waking up at night, because their glucose levels drop too low.
Yep, because their brain is now hungry.
Mm-hmm.
They're not stomach body hungry, but their brain is hungry for a bit of fuel.
And does that usually happen in a person who's been eating too much sugar all day, or just that can happen to anyone?
That can be anybody.
That can be anybody.
Yep, that can be anybody.
Mm-hmm.
But and again, specifically as we talked about, anybody in that injured state is going to be upregulated a little bit. They need a little more, so it's more likely to happen to them. So what do you have with? Again, we'll go on kind of the extreme. What do you have with concussions? You have lots and lots of sleep problems because they're looking. Part of it is they're always looking for that glucose because they're trying to heal, and the brain's not completely shutting down because it's still wanting fuel.
So is that type of person, just going back again to this, sort of full circle here, is that type of person always high on the sympathetic nervous system response? Are they, and not in the parasympathetic is what we want relaxation, and they can't get there sometimes because they're just always stressed.
It's always a stressor. Yeah, it's a stressor. Your brain is saying, I don't have enough food. That's a stressor. I'm starving. That's a pretty big stressor.
Yeah, exactly. So interesting. So
but most people don't read it that way.
Yeah.
They just read it as, I've got this sleep problem. I've got in nighttime I've got a sleep problem. In the daytime I've got my knee problem, and mid-afternoon I've got this like sugar craving problem. But none of them are related.
Yeah, and
even though I had some kind of neurology-based problem, might have been injury, might have been concussion. The other big one with, to come kind of full circle, we talk about concussions, the big one, whiplashes, but in my practice in the last little while, I've really started to see and notice much more very similar look with someone who's had an extreme emotional trauma.
Right.
It's like somebody's hit them in the head, and their brain responds exactly the same way as a physical injury.
So grief's
a big
trauma.
Loss, big loss.
Right.
Big loss.
And they're showing the symptoms of really having like a concussion or some kind of thing.
Yeah, especially loss is a big one because it's usually sudden, or it's usually very profound. So it's like a big whack in the head. For some, it's something that's just more sudden, that just kind of blows a circuit. But it looks the same as your brain responds exactly the same as these physical injuries. Right? The brain wants to upregulate, right? It blows this circuit, it wants to upregulate and repair that area.
Right.
But often, and the problem with, the one thing we see with someone who's athletic and active and has head injury of some kind, they want to get back at it. The person who's in this grief position, they don't really know what's happening, and they don't really care.
Yeah.
Because they've got other things they're dealing with.
Right.
And that's a little harder.
So depression.
So we usually don't see those till later on.
So depression kind of sets in for those
That can
people.
certainly set in,
Yeah. And so we've kind of talked about a lot of things today. But I was just like thrilled of that this last piece, that our brain won't heal unless we have the problem. Because of course my background with nutrition, and then also the stress factor being such a important part of it. And that's again where yoga and restorative yoga can really help that kind of person. and checking their balance. So even the person that might have grief could have that imbalance going on. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's a really good test for people to do, to just see where they're at and then try to figure it out from there. Yeah. All right, I think we'll end right there. Thank you so much, Brian, for such an informative and excellent explanation of what's going on in our body and our brain. Thank you very much for tuning in. Don't forget, Susanne Jakubowski on YouTube, SuzanneJ.com on my website. You'll see this video put on there. Sign up for my newsletter, then you'll get all the great information that we have. And stay tuned for our next episode with Brian.